The beginning of the forced relocation of Japanese Americans can be attributed to one single event, the December 7, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. Before 1941, the mass immigration of Japanese to America, usually the Hawaiian Islands or the West Coast, began around 1868 and slowed around 1908 when the U.S. and the then Empire of Japan implemented the Gentlemen's Agreement, banning immigration of unskilled laborers. Immigration completely ended in 1924 when the Immigration Act was passed by the U.S., implementing a set quota of undesirables from Asian countries. With this Immigration Act came the categorization of Japanese in the U.S. The Issei are defined as Japanese who immigrated before 1924 or those born outside of the U.S. They are first-generation Japanese Americans, while the Nisei are second-generation Japanese, those born after 1924 or those born in the U.S. They are automatically American citizens. December 7th at 7:48 a.m., Pearl Harbor Naval Base on the island of Oahu was attacked. 2,403 American soldiers were killed and 1,178 others were wounded, with only 64 Japanese servicemen killed. This attack prompted the U.S. to declare war on Japan the following day, and the U.S.'s official entry into World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor caused American leaders, both militarily and politically, to suspect a mainland attack by Japan on the west coast of the United States. Before this attack, public opinion by Americans did not believe that the Japanese Americans living in the U.S. had any plans of espionage against the United States, and believed them to be loyal Americans. Attorney General of the United States Francis G. Bibble believed that any friendly aliens, Japanese as well as German and Italian, in the United States, not believed to be conspiring against the United States, be given the rights appointed to them under the Constitution. By February 1942, public and governmental opinion of Japanese Americans had changed. The growing fear of a Japanese fifth column, or a group of people who undermine a larger group from within, caused the U.S. government to move to relocate all Japanese Americans, regardless of their generational status or how much of a relationship they had with Japan. Executive Order 9066 was signed on February 19, 1942, which required all people that fell under the title of enemy alien to evacuate a designated area along the west coast and be moved inland.
Their evacuation did not imply individual disloyalty, but was ordered to reduce a military hazard at a time when danger of invasion was great. 2/3 of the evacuees are American citizens by right of birth. The rest are their Japanese-born parents and grandparents. The people are not under suspicion. They are not prisoners. They are not internees. They are merely dislocated people, the unwounded casualties of war.
On March 2nd, Japanese Americans following Executive Order 9066 were ordered to stay in Military Area No. 1, pending more plans to come by the U.S. government. On March 24th, an 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. curfew was given to all enemy aliens in Military Area No. 1, and specific civilian exclusion orders were given to Japanese Americans located in areas of concern, the first being Bainbridge Island in Washington State, because of their proximity to multiple naval bases. The Japanese Americans on Bainbridge Island were the first Japanese people to be relocated during this time. On March 27th, all Japanese people in Military Area No. 1 were prohibited to leave. On May 3rd, all people of Japanese ancestry still living in Military Area No. 1 were given notice to report to assembly centers, where they would stay till moved to permanent concentration camps. The total number of Japanese people sent to these camps is estimated to be around 120,000, with roughly 80,000 of them being second generation or higher, and the remaining first generation. While the Japanese people from the continental U.S. were being relocated to camps, Japanese people on the islands of Hawaii stayed largely uninterred, except for around 1,800 who were sent to concentration camps. The Japanese people in Hawaii were protected from being interred on the count that Hawaii had been placed under martial law and was viewed as being of a lesser security risk of sabotage than mainland America, and that 1/3 of Hawaii's total population was Japanese, and their removal would damage the state's economy. In addition to the U.S., over 2,200 Japanese people, regardless of their generational status, were taken from Latin American countries to be interned in camps run by the U.S. Department of Justice and the Immigration and Naturalization Services. Of those 2,200, over 2/3 of them came from Peru. Before being transferred to permanent concentration camps, Japanese Americans were confined in temporary civilian assembly centers set up by the Wartime Civilian Control Administration. These temporary centers, located primarily in California, were usually previously used as racetracks, horse stables, or fairgrounds, and the stay at these camps lasted from a month to 5, as the permanent camps were still being built. While the relocation of Japanese Americans to these civilian assembly centers had been quick, the relocation to the camps took much longer. The stay at these camps for some began in March, and for others did not end until November 1942. For the next 3 years, Japanese Americans were placed in concentration camps scattered around the U.S. 10 concentration camps were built in total, the most populated being Tule Lake in California. The max population reached 18,789, followed by Paston in Arizona with 17,814, and Gila River in Arizona as well with 13,345.
At each relocation center, evacuees were met by an advance contingent of Japanese who had arrived some days earlier and who now acted as guides. Naturally, the newcomers looked about with some curiosity. They were in a new area, on land that was raw, untamed, but full of opportunity. Here they would build schools, educate their children, reclaim the desert. Their own physicians took precautions to guard against epidemics. They opened advanced Americanization classes for college students, who in turn would instruct other groups. They made a rough beginning at self-government, for while the Army would guard the outer limits of each area, community life and security within were largely up to the Japanese themselves. They immediately saw the need for developing civic leaders. At weekly community meetings, citations were given to the block leaders who had worked most diligently. Special emphasis was put on the health and care of these American children of Japanese descent. Their parents, most of whom are American citizens, and their grandparents, who are aliens, immediately wanted to go to work. At Manzanar, they built a lath house and began rooting guayuli cuttings. The plants, when mature, will add to our rubber supply. At Parker, they undertook the irrigation of fertile desert lands. Meanwhile, in areas away from the coast and under appropriate safeguards, many were permitted to enter private employment, particularly to work in sugar beet fields where labor was badly needed. Now, this brief picture is actually the prologue to a story that is yet to be told. The full story will begin to unfold when the raw lands of the desert turn green, when all adult hands are at productive work on public lands or in private employment. It will be fully told only when circumstances permit the loyal American citizens once again to enjoy the freedom we in this country cherish, and when the disloyal, we hope, have left this country for good. In the meantime, we are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency. And we won't change this fundamental decency no matter what our enemies do. But of course, we hope most earnestly that our example will influence the Axis powers in their treatment of Americans who fall into their hands.
In December of 1944, it was announced that in the January of the next year, the exclusion orders on Japanese Americans would be lifted. Over that next year, the internees moved out of the camps, many returning back to their Pacific Coast homes. By September, the same month as the formal surrender of Japan following the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 5 months after the May 8th armistice ending the war in Europe, after Germany's unconditional surrender, the rate of internees leaving the camps reached 2,000 per week. By December, all camps but Tule Lake, which remained open holding people accused of being security risk, were closed. Reparations redress for what Japanese Americans lost during this time was a long, drawn-out process. Originally, in 1948, 3 years following the closing of the concentration camps, the Evacuations Claims Act was created to provide compensation for property lost while being displaced. Around 23,700 Japanese Americans applied, with a total of $131 million in damages. However, the U.S. Department of Justice and Congress only allocated $38 million and required written information for what was lost. Most do not have these documents as they were lost during relocation, leading to many accepting the governmental offer of only $2,500 in damages. Beginning in the late 60s and early 70s during the Civil Rights Movement, second-generation Japanese Americans began pushing for a reassessment of the reparations awarded to their parents and grandparents. In 1976, on the 34th anniversary of FDR's Executive Order 9066 that began the relocation of Japanese Americans, President Gerald R. Ford signed Proclamation 4417, which officially ended the relocation program that was still legally on the books. Over the following years, many of the sites of former concentration camps became registered on the National Registry of Historical Places, and several presidents to follow began establishing camps as national monuments. In 2006, President George W. Bush authorized $38 million towards the preservation of various sites where Japanese Americans were held. President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 into law on August 10th, which only authorized the redress payments. The payments still needed to be fitted into the U.S. federal budget, but this did snowball the process as the House of Representatives and Senate worked to agree on the final version and the official amount of redress. The redress for Japanese Americans happened on November 21st, 1989, when President George W. Bush signed H.R. 2991 into law, allowing payments of redress to begin. This was 47 years after Executive Order 9066 was incepted. The redress gave to $20,000 each to the Japanese Americans interned during the war. Nevertheless, the redress was limited to Japanese Americans that were official U.S. citizens or permanent residences, meaning the 2,200 Japanese Latin Americans relocated to camps were not provided with the same reparations, and the lobbying against the U.S. government still continues to this day.
Trump's policy advisors are discussing drafting a proposal to reinstate a registry for immigrants from Muslim countries,
Yeah, and to be perfectly honest, it is legal. They say it'll hold constitutional muster. I know the ACLU is going to challenge it, but I think it'll pass, and we've done it with Iran back a while ago. We did it during World War II with Japanese, which, you know, call it what you will, maybe wrong.
You're not proposing we go back to the days of internment camps, I hope.
No, I'm not proposing that at all, Megan. But what I am saying is that we need to protect America.
That's the kind of stuff that gets people scared, Carl.